It was something I witnessed many years ago that I still wonder about today and have found no explanation for it. When I was little, my parents would take me to a restaurant near my house and eat many dishes that I liked every weekend night. Then the whole family would walk home together. That day, we also went out to eat as usual. On the way back from the restaurant, I suddenly needed to urinate. At this moment, I caught a glimpse of my parents looking at each other. It seemed they didn't want me to have a pee here. At that time, I thought that my parents worried about me when I was alone because it was relatively dark and the village roads were solitary. But because I couldn't take it anymore, they agreed. After that, my father warned me not to go too far from them and hurry back as soon as I finished. Hearing that, I was also a little annoyed because I often ran in the morning on this road. It was not strange. Why were my parents so worried? But that thought also quickly disappeared, and I went to find a place to deal with my need. After that, I turned into a small alley to pee, and my parents stood outside on the main road waiting for me. At that time, I was young, so I didn't know anything to be afraid of. I just wanted to deal with my need quickly and return home, so I picked a wall and started peeing. I felt so comfortable. I quickly pulled up my pants and adjusted my clothes to prepare to return to my parents. However, there was a noise from the end of the dark alley when I was about to turn around. It made me stop. It sounded like footsteps, but it sounded so loud and messy, it didn't seem like the footsteps of only one person. I thought to myself that who would walk in this dark alley at this hour? After that, the footsteps got closer and closer to me. It was the footsteps of many people. They walked very quickly and unevenly. The footsteps were very heavy, creating a loud noise that reverberated throughout the alley. I kept staring at where the footsteps came from to see who they were. A moment later, the shadow of 3 tall men slowly passed before my eyes, but it was too dark to see their figures. But I suddenly felt that something was wrong because their faces were strange. Although I couldn't see it clearly, I was sure it wasn't the face of an ordinary person, which surprised and intrigued me. So I no longer cared that my parents were waiting outside, but hurriedly followed these strange people to see where they were going. At that time, I didn't know if it was because I was young, so I was running slowly, or because they were going fast, but for a moment I couldn't see them anymore. I didn't know why, but I still tried to run to the end of the alley and hide behind the wall. I finally saw those 3 strangers. They were doing something very shady and stealthy. I was curious, so I silently watched. But what made me more curious was that the faces of the 3 of them were wearing red masks, which looked very strange. They looked like demons, with large white eyes and 2 pointed fangs sticking out from the outside. They stood in front of an old-looking house, then moved closer as if wanting to go inside. But what happened next terrified me. As soon as 3 strangers approached the door, they suddenly disappeared. At that time, I was so scared and couldn't believe my eyes. I almost wanted to scream out of panic and amazement. But then, for some reason, I tried to calm myself and silently continued to watch in front of that house because I thought for sure they would come back out. And indeed, it was. Just a moment later, from the void, they suddenly appeared again, holding something in their hands. I strained my eyes to see clearly what was in their hands and why it was taken from this house. Then that thing made me even more terrified. In their hands were 3 human heads. I still remembered the scene vividly. Apparently of a man, a woman, and a child. Blood was still dripping from those heads to the ground a lot. After witnessing that scene, I could only cover my mouth with my hand for fear. If I made a sound, they would probably kill me. I was so scared that I just wanted to cry out loud. My tears were also waiting to flow. Looking at those evil faces made me panic even more, wondering who they were. After that, they passed me by. They still didn't seem to notice me. Those people held 3 heads in their hands, slowly left and disappeared into the alley. I was still in shock, so my body couldn't move anymore. I just stood there and watched those people until they gradually disappeared. At that time, I thought I was hallucinating. As a 10-year-old child, I had no understanding of such spiritual or demonic matters. My parents saw that I had been gone for too long, so they worriedly went to find me. When I heard my parents call, it was like I came back to my senses. I quickly told my parents the story from earlier because I thought someone must have been murdered in that house. But of course, my parents didn't believe me. They thought I was making up stories or had hallucinations because it was too dark. So I got angry and insisted that I had seen it with my own eyes. I also mentioned that I saw strange people wearing red demon masks and they went into the house and killed the people inside. Seeing that, my parents still did not believe me. I hurried to the front door where the 3 strange people were standing earlier. My own eyes saw the blood dripping on the ground. I was sure the blood was still there, so I wanted to show it to my parents. But when both of my parents arrived, they started to look at me with even more suspicion, which confused me. Because right now, there wasn't a single trace of murder on the ground. The ground was completely devoid of any blood. My father still wanted to believe me, so he tried to go to the door to check. If what I said was true, the door would have an intruder sign. But when my father came to check the door, it was still intact, with no signs of tampering. So I got scolded by my mother because they thought I had gone out and lied about the devil. After that, although I was upset, I had no way to prove my words, so I had to regretfully follow my parents home, listening to them nagging along the way. In the days that followed, I seemed to forget about the strange incident, until one day the village suddenly became noisy, as if something serious was happening. People flocked to see a lot of people. I was also curious to see if it turned out that the house I saw that night was having a big deal going on. The people in the village were also very bewildered. I heard that all 3 people in the family had just died last night due to eating poisonous mushrooms, but only were discovered this morning. To this day, I didn't know if that family's death had anything to do with what I saw the night before. Later, when I found out about the mask, as far as I knew, it had the same shape as a ghoul. According to Japanese beliefs, ghouls could come and capture the souls of the living. But what the truth was, I couldn't be quite sure. The story happened to my grandfather when he was young. One night, he was carrying bundles of firewood into the storeroom before the rain came, when suddenly from outside the gate came a very violent knock on the door. It was late at night. At this time, someone must have come to an urgent matter. Thinking about it, Grandpa quickly put down the pile of firewood in his hand, grabbed the oil lamp and went to open the gate. It turned out that it was Uncle Fang, the village head, and my grandfather was also a little surprised because he did not understand why the village head was still looking for him at this time. Grandpa wondered what was wrong, but Uncle Fang didn't answer, just stared at my grandfather. Uncle Fang then said nothing and went straight into the house. My grandfather also noticed something strange about Uncle Fang, so he still tried to ask Uncle Fang, but in return there was silence. The atmosphere at this time was becoming more and more strange and confusing. My grandfather looked at Uncle Fang's back, suddenly realized that his gait today was very strange, like a puppet being controlled, looking a bit scary. At this time, my grandfather felt that Uncle Fang was no longer normal. He also suspected something, but still tried not to think too much. Before my grandpa could close the gate, he rushed to Uncle Fang and put his hand on his shoulder to ask what happened. At this time, being held back, Uncle Fang slowly turned around, still refusing to say a word. When he turned his face completely, my grandfather quickly raised the oil lamp to see Uncle Fang's face clearly. As expected, even Uncle Fang's face had become strange and confusing. At first glance, he knew that Uncle Fang had encountered something with bad luck. My grandfather shook Uncle Fang's body to wake him up. After shaking for a while, Uncle Fang's face also returned to normal. Suddenly he fell to the ground unconscious. My grandfather was also very surprised and quickly called him to wake up. At that moment, for a moment, my grandfather saw a figure standing outside the gate. It was a little figure, like a child. It stood at the door, staring inside, its face very lifeless, scary. But as soon as my grandfather turned around to get a better look, the child ran away very quickly. Because Uncle Fang was fainting, my grandfather didn't give chase, but it was the shadow of a child. My grandpa wondered that all the children in the village have gone to sleep. So who was that child just now? Not thinking much, worrying about the village head was more important, so Grandpa put those thoughts aside and looked at Uncle Fang's situation, who was now unconscious on the ground. Uncle Fang's mouth was foaming, and it looked very heavy. Grandpa hastily used folk remedies to wake Uncle Fang up. After a long time using many other tools, Uncle Fang was also regaining consciousness. Uncle Fang wasn't fully awake yet, but he kept saying that he had seen a ghost. Then his eyes widened, his body trembled as if he was very scared, and his mouth kept saying that there were ghosts and that his son was dead. Hearing this, my grandfather was also surprised and asked the village head to explain everything that had happened. Although he was still tired, Uncle Fang still began to tell everything. Uncle Fang was a village head who recently moved to the village. The rainy season was also coming if it rained too much. It would cause floods, making people in the village extremely miserable. So Uncle Fang gathered the strong men in the village to strengthen the dam. But when everyone was working and digging up the soil to add more to the dam, suddenly they saw something scary sticking out of the ground. It was a coffin. Seeing this, everyone hurriedly informed the village head. Uncle Fang also told everyone to stop working and asked if anyone knew who this coffin belonged to. After questioning the village for a while, 2 men finally came and examined the matter of the coffin. They prevented Uncle Fang from continuing to build the dike, but instead dug the coffin up and buried it properly before continuing. But the village head disagreed because no one knew about this coffin and the dam construction was extremely urgent. Although a bit annoyed and disagreed, listening to the village head's persuasion that it was for the sake of the whole village, the 2 brothers reluctantly obeyed his uncle's words without making offerings or anything else. After that, the work on the dike also continued. Everyone started to fill the coffin with soil and continued to prepare for the dike. Because the flood season was coming, everyone was busy with work and forgot about the coffin. But, unexpectedly, that night was also Uncle Fang's fateful day. That night, his eldest daughter took an oil lamp and said she would go to her uncle's house nearby. But after waiting for a long time, it was already late and Uncle Fang still hadn't seen his daughter come back. He started to feel insecure. After that, Uncle Fang decided to look for his daughter. On the way, he suddenly saw a familiar figure from afar right at the corner of the wall, holding the oil lamp that his daughter had brought with her earlier. Feeling puzzled, Uncle Fang called out but saw no response from his daughter, so he went over there and examined the situation. It was dark, so the air inside the corner of the wall became even hazier. The light from the oil lamp made everything very magical. The daughter stood leaning against the wall. Her head was down and unresponsive when Uncle Fang called. As Uncle Fang brought the lamp closer to his daughter's face, the horrors became clear. A rope out of nowhere was hooking her daughter's neck as if she had intentionally hanged herself. This thing made Uncle Fang extremely panicked. He couldn't believe his eyes. He called out his daughter's name, but to no avail. His legs trembled and he could no longer stand. The scary scene was clear now. The rope was tied through the branch above. It was like a noose and took the life of his daughter. Her face had become white. Blood veins emerged crimson in both eyes, and a long striped tongue looked extremely scary. Uncle Fang still tried to bring his hand to her nose to check again. He couldn't believe his daughter was dead. Uncle Fang panicked, turned around and ran away as fast as he could. He planned to run to his brother's house nearby to find help, and since his younger brother also had some understanding of spiritual matters, he thought his brother might be able to help because his daughter's death was so strange. He was in a hurry to run when suddenly he was distracted by a noise coming from behind. It was the sound of footsteps. It echoed through the empty street, getting louder and louder like someone was running behind him. Uncle Fang slowly stopped and listened more carefully. He came to a complete stop now. Something enchanting made him slowly turn around. Uncle Fang glimpsed a figure slowly approaching him from the darkness of the road. A stream of cold air ran down his spine, causing Uncle Fang to panic. He shouted to ask what the person behind him was, which also helped him to be less afraid. After that, the shadow of the other person also gradually approached him. Under the dim moonlight, the shadow's face was also more visible. But the other face was very strange. The eyes were wide and bloodshot. Its face was pale and the mouth was smiling, a ghostly smile. Uncle Fang was too scared to scream for help, because he also sensed that what was standing in front of him was not a human. But for some reason his eyes got tired right after that, and then slowly fell asleep without knowing when. After that he couldn't remember anything until he woke up and met my grandfather. He told my grandfather everything and also described it as a small childlike figure. My grandfather also heard about the kid who drowned in the lake. For some reason the family buried it next to the reservoir. Because of some floods, the tombstone was also lost. The kid's family also moved to another place, so no one remembers this anymore. Then my grandfather and Uncle Fang went to the place where the daughter had been hanged to check. When they got there, they took the girl's body down. She was dead. Uncle Fang was extremely sad. The following day, Uncle Fang called everyone to come and dig up the child's coffin to move it to another place. He also invited the shaman to come and pay respects to him. Uncle Fang was extremely painful because the departure of his daughter was also because of his haste. That thing made him regret it for a long time later. Until now, this story has spread widely in my village. It was summer and the weather was burning hot. To get some fresh air, some men huddled together and sat in front of the alley. At night, mosquitoes became more active. They were everywhere and bit them, so they became irritated and scowled. When everyone noticed that the sky was getting darker, they all decided to go home early. The old men banded together and they didn't forget to tell Uncle Pew to hurry back home because they heard rumors of ghosts appearing in this area recently. Uncle Pew could only laugh after hearing them grumble and heading home one by one. Because he didn't intend to go home at this time anyways, so he hummed to let everyone go first. Talk about Uncle Pew. He came to this village many years ago to live with his family and work as a teacher, but he was unlucky because his wife died young, leaving only him and his children. They grew up and moved to the city to pursue their careers, leaving him alone in this village. Coming home in this hot weather was very uncomfortable for such a lonely person, so it was better to sit outside and enjoy the air thinking, and then Uncle Pew kept smoking. Because it was full moon day, the moon was especially big and bright, accompanied by the quiet atmosphere of the poor countryside, which really made people feel more lonely and cold. Uncle Pew was still sitting there, unsure what to think. The cigarette butts were all over his feet, and he had no idea how long he had been sitting there. But Uncle Pew didn't care. He continued to smoke and think about life without returning home, and as a result, he witnessed something horrifying. Uncle Pew took out the last cigarette from the box, thinking that when he finished it, he would return home, so he slowly took it out. Then lighted it up, took a long breath. The light from the lighter was most likely the only glimmer at this point. The sound of footsteps from afar suddenly sounded in that quiet space, catching Uncle Pew's attention. Because it was too late at this time, there was no one left to walk down the street. The entire street was most likely just him who hadn't returned home. Uncle Pew looked up, curious to see who it was. The silhouettes of two people slowly approached from the darkness, looking at the tall figures that were most probably men, even though he couldn't see them clearly, but still could figure that they looked very unusual. The two men did not walk up to Uncle Pew, but rather around a nearby stone mill. Uncle Pew had no idea what they were up to or what they were saying. Only glimpses of their figures could be seen. They just kept going around the mill. Uncle Pew slowly stood up and approached them, asking what they were doing and if he could help them in any way as a diversion, because he didn't want to go home alone anyway. Uncle Pew approached and inquired, but received no response from the other two, who were still walking around the mill, unsure what to do. It appeared to be two tall figures. But why were they always lowering their heads like that? Perhaps they were looking for something on the ground, so Uncle Pew directly stated that he had a flashlight, which could assist them in finding it more easily. At this point, they began to respond to Uncle Pew, but their voices were shaky and made the hairs on their back of the listener's neck shiver, as if they were speaking from the underworld rather than living people. But that wasn't what bothered Uncle Pew. It was the fact that they claimed to be looking for their heads. Uncle Pew was stunned and motionless as a result of the response. Then, in the dim moonlight, Uncle Pew noticed an anomaly from the other two, who were clearly speaking to him, but he couldn't see their heads. It was impossible to talk while bowing at the same time. When Uncle Pew noticed that things were getting stranger, he decided to turn on his flashlight and shined it on them to see who they were, because there was no one in this village he didn't know. He asked their names, shining at them at the same time. Uncle Pew directly shone on their faces as the light began to shine from below. They still did not respond. As the flashlight slowly shone on the body, a terrible thing appeared in front of Uncle Pew's eyes, making him panic. Not that they had their heads down, but they had no heads at all. Uncle Pew's heart was pounding and sweating as he realized he had met devils and that everything in front of him was too frightening. At the same time, the other two demons kept asking Uncle Pew if he had seen their heads. They searched for a long time but couldn't find them. Their shapes were gradually becoming stranger and stranger. That increased his panic and fear, and Uncle Pew fell backwards, but his legs were frozen without realizing it, causing him to fall backwards and drop the cigarettes in his mouth. The surrounding space seemed to come to a halt. It gradually darkened and the other two demons moved towards Uncle Pew. Nothing but the voices of the other two demons could be heard at this time. They got closer. The sound became more piercing. Uncle Pew looked at them in terror. Even more terrifying, their silhouettes became increasingly distorted, making them appear monstrous. Suddenly, he felt his head spinning, and the pain was so intense that it appeared as if someone was hitting it with a hammer. Uncle Pew began to feel suffocated, which was accompanied by an unfathomable stench that hit his nose. Then the surrounding atmosphere went black, and Uncle Pew passed out. Hallucinations began to appear in his mind. The stone mill kept appearing in his mind. Next, a clear scene began to appear more clearly, and Uncle Pew saw many people standing around the stone mill. They dressed like the old-style Japanese army, and they still had guns and swords in their hands. They looked threatening. Then there was an image of two men with their hands tied and kneeling on the ground, while the other soldiers waved their swords ready to cut off their heads. A man with a violent appearance, who appeared to be the commander, raised his hand to issue orders to those soldiers. The sharp sword was raised to its full height and slashed down hard. Blood splattered everywhere, even on the soldiers' faces, but on their lips were merciless smiles. The sharp sword severed the two heads, which fell to the ground and stared at Uncle Pew. The two heads were lying on the ground, and their bodies were hung in front of the village gate by the soldiers. The villagers were so terrified that they didn't dare to bring the two heads to bury. Seeing these things made Uncle Pew panic and startle awake. Everything was so real that Uncle Pew felt as if he had just witnessed the execution at that time. But as soon as he opened his eyes, he realized he was still in the village, and the two headless young men from earlier were also approaching him. He screamed and fainted again in terror. Not sure how long he had been lying there, but he faintly heard a voice calling him in his ear, but didn't dare to open his eyes. Despite the villagers' attempt to wake him up and ask him why he was lying here, Uncle Pew refused to open his eyes. It was only until he had calmed down a little and the sunlight was shining in his eyes that he dared to slowly open his eyes and see two people from the village looking at him with suspicion. Uncle Pew stood up. He heard that when people started to go to work early in the morning, they saw him lying on the ground and came to wake him up. Many people gathered because they thought Uncle Pew had seen a ghost last night. Uncle Pew had no idea he'd been lying out there all night, nor did he know when he fainted. He began to tell everyone everything. Uncle Pew also described their appearance and costumes and confirmed that the two ghosts were looking for their heads in this area. When an old man who had lived in the village for a long time heard that and recalled the past, there were two young men from the village that were executed at this very mill, but their heads were stolen by wild animals. and their bodies were buried by the villagers. People could observe two headless strangers prowling around on the full moon nights after that time. They always asked where their heads were each time they met any villagers. The voices would sound as if it had came straight from hell. It was a strange story that happened that made my whole village stir and bewildered for a long time. The story happened on a day in late summer, early autumn, when my whole village sank into the inherent peace. There was a family that encountered a bad thing. At that time, the wife was busy preparing food in the kitchen. Suddenly, realizing that the vegetables were running out, then she asked her husband to go down to the warehouse to pick more vegetables. The husband listened to his wife's words, leisurely entered the house, smoked a cigarette, and walked towards the warehouse. Since then, his family had lived by farming, so the house always built a warehouse to store harvested vegetables. Usually, the family's food reserves were kept in a secret cellar that only family members knew. This thing was a habit that had been passed down through generations in the house. As usual, the husband went straight to the mouth of the tunnel, slowly crouched down. He opened the lid, looked inside and briefly checked it because it was a place to store food, but few people frequented it, so there were often rats and a few reptiles living there. After feeling safe, the husband followed the vertical ladder placed close to the foundation and went down to the basement. The whole basement without light became extremely dark, but it made few strange noises that made the husband curious and look around. As soon as he arrived, he immediately panicked because he saw a flock of colorful poisonous snakes wiggling on the ground, eyes wide open looking at him. The husband had never seen the strange snake before, so he panicked and shouted and clung to the ladder, looking for a way up. The snake saw the husband run away and immediately chased after him. They slithered in long rows close to his heels, causing him to panic, constantly calling his wife to help. The wife heard her husband's voice, immediately put aside the cooking, hurriedly ran to her husband to check it out. Looking at the panicked expression on her husband's face, the wife felt extremely worried and then asked him about what had happened. Even though the husband had reached a safe place, he was still afraid in his heart. He kept telling his wife that he encountered a herd of snakes under the basement, surprising her. The wife found it hard to understand because there had been no snake that could sneak into the family's basement since then. To be sure, she also actively went to the place to check. The husband immediately stepped back and pointed to the mouth of the basement, which had not yet been closed. He told his wife to calm down because the number of snakes below was many, possibly up to a dozen. The wife was very confident at first, but when she approached the mouth of the basement, she heard a noise below and began to feel uneasy in her heart. She cautiously looked down at the mouth of the basement to check if there were snakes like her husband said. Indeed, the scene unfolding before her eyes made her scream. With her own eyes, she had seen the small snakes squirming together in the dark basement, which she did not know before. Not only that, but these snakes are also very aggressive. The snakes saw the wife looking at them, immediately jumped up, bared their venomous fangs to scare the wife into shock. The husband saw that and went to his wife, hugged her. Both of them thought together about how to deal with the crowd of snakes below. The husband was very reckless at first, pulled up his sleeves and then went straight to the basement, wanting to catch each snake by himself. The wife saw this and immediately went to stop her husband for fear that he was in danger. After that, she pondered for a while and then asked her husband to light a large torch to bring in. The husband listened to his wife, immediately went out and turned back with a big torch. When he reached the mouth of the basement, the husband threw the burning torch down from above, burning down dozens of snakes below. The light from the fire on the torch illuminated the entire basement, revealing the space inside. From the bottom rose a thick smoky grey smoke with an unpleasant odor. The higher the smoke rose, the more it would change into a thick grey black as big as a large tornado, creeping through the door frames of the house, flying out and disappearing into the air. After the smoke cleared, the couple hugged each other and crept back to the basement to check the movement, but everything seemed to have become quieter. The husband slowly looked down. At this time, the husband breathed a sigh of relief and told his wife everything was fine. He did not see a snake anymore. After everything was resolved, the husband immediately told his wife to continue her work and he would go down to the basement to pick up food for his wife. The husband had just arrived at the place. The worry about the snakes earlier rose in him. The husband saw this, immediately looked for a wooden stick and then slowly went deep, his eyes constantly looking around. The sound of his footsteps echoed throughout the basement, creating an uncomfortably tense atmosphere. He carefully checked every nook and cranny of the basement so as not to miss a single snake. Suddenly, he was caught by a rustling sound. He walked to the source of the sound, raised a wooden stick, held it tightly and slowly walked over to check. As he approached, the husband saw a large white snake curled up in the corner of the room, hiding behind the family's food baskets. The husband saw the scene and panicked and shouted. Reflexively, he kept raising the wooden stick and slamming it down. In the first hit, the white snake was fortunate to dodge, but on the second hit, the wooden stick hit the white snake's head, causing red blood to splash. The snake then lay dead on the ground, surrounded by the blood that made the husband dumbfounded. He looked in horror at the snake's large body lying in front of him and quickly handled it, then turned back up. At this time, he felt tired in his body, so he went to bed to rest. But in the evening, the husband kept lying on the bed no matter how much his wife and children called. He refused to get up to eat. The husband stayed like that until the following morning, making his wife feel both strange and worried. The wife planned to go to the market to buy some things, but she felt insecure as soon as she got out of the house. She decided to return home immediately, running into the room to wake the husband up. After a while, when the husband did not answer, the wife jerked the blanket off to check. At this time, the wife panicked when she saw her husband lying motionless on the bed with his body curled up like a snake, looking very scary. The wife saw the horror scene and screamed and quickly ran out. Suddenly, she remembered her husband's story of killing snakes and thought of an idea. So, she went to invite the best magician in the village to come to help her heal her husband. She alone brought the magician into the house. As soon as the magician reached the courtyard, his heart suddenly appeared a sense of uneasiness. He followed the wife into the bedroom to check. The wife did not expect the situation to become so serious. Based on the celestial eye, the magician saw the spirit of the white snake wrapping around the husband's body, waiting for the day to eat the meat. The magician did not rush to conclusions, so he turned to ask the wife if there were snakes in the house recently. Hearing that, the wife also nodded to confirm. She told the story about the snakes in the basement yesterday to the magician. After listening, the magician sighed, saying that the family had accidentally killed the white snake, a dangerous snake. When the wife heard it, she panicked, cried, and begged the magician to save the life of her husband and the whole family. The magician saw that the wife was also pitiful, so he immediately thought of a way to help this poor family. After pondering for a while, the magician also told the wife that the white snake was very angry now. It was difficult to forgive her and her husband, but there was only one way that could help them. So the magician asked the wife to lead him down to the basement where the white snake and his children had lived to build an altar. The wife was busy helping the magician with a hand, preparing a large respectful altar to apologize to the white snake. The magician, after preparing the altar, also began to bless and worship and then left. Before leaving, he still did not forget to instruct the wife every year on this day to celebrate the death anniversary of the white snake and regularly worship and beg for the white snake to forgive her sins. The husband soon regained consciousness, but his spirit was broken and weak. Listening to his wife tell everything, he was also very repentant, going to the white snake altar alone to apologize. Since then, the food storage basement in the house has become a place to worship the white snakes, and the altar is always full of incense and food. One day in early spring, in my peaceful village, suddenly appeared a luxury car. It parked in front of the brick house at the end of the village. It was the house of the best magician in my village at that time. Inside the house, the magician was focusing on burning incense on the altar, preparing to go to work. Below was a middle-aged, rich-looking man sitting nervously on the ground. After burning the incense, the magician turned to the man and asked why he had come here. When the man finished listening, he began to recount in a gentle voice. The man said that lately he had been having a very scary nightmare that kept repeating for many nights, making it impossible for him to get a good night's sleep. His face was also from there, was an intense burning pain, hot as if someone was on fire in the middle of the night. His whole body was always in a state of fatigue, heavy as if someone was pressing on him. As soon as he closed his eyes to fall asleep, he saw that he was being attacked by a ragged man who looked like a beggar, rushing to attack him with an extremely aggressive attitude. The man kept grabbing his face, shouting hateful screams that made him extremely scared. In particular, he was always haunted by his horror face every time the man put his face on him. It was a face that was disfigured, with only crimson flesh, because there was no human skin. The man looked up at him with his bloodshot red eyes, his mouth moving as if he wanted to say something. Then the strange man raised his hand tightly to the rich man's face, a feeling of pain and terror now overwhelming him. Then the strange man used strong force to tear off the skin of the rich man's face, making his face look like the ghost in front of him. Because of that terrible nightmare, this rich man had been haunted for many days, to the point of not daring to sleep at night, making his health gradually weaker. He wanted to find a way to end this dream as quick as possible, so he traveled a long way from the city to come here, asking this famous magician to help. After listening to the story, the magician's face suddenly changed. He looked seriously at the man in front of him. The magician seemed to sense that the man was hiding something terrible. So, the magician went to the altar, took 3 incense sticks, recited the mantra while holding the incense, and walked around the man to find his past. The man then began to dream. His mind also gradually recalled the things that happened before. Unexpectedly, it was a barbaric story full of horror. The man's face showed his remorse as he recalled the past events. The magician stood in front of the man and looked at him sternly. His feeling was indescribable, as if the magician had known the beginning and the end of the story. Many years ago, this man knew a colleague in the company. The two were not very close, but to promote, he invited his colleague to have a meal. While drunk, the two disagreed because of disagreements. The man was angry, grabbed the bottle of wine, placed it on the table, rushed to beat the colleague. With one hand, the man grabbed his colleague by the neck. With the other, he raised his hand and slammed the bottle of wine on the head of his colleague. The sound of a bottle breaking was heard, and blood was also splattered. His colleague fell to the ground dead on the spot. The death of his colleague seemed to wake him up and realize he had just made a terrible mistake. The man was so scared he decided to leave his colleague's body lying there and then ran out alone as fast as he could. He returned to his own home, packed up his things, and began to flee elsewhere. After a while, he became a man wandering the market corners. During the day, he asked for money from passerby. At night, he found a temporary corner to sleep in, and constantly recalling the past time in his mind. Until one day, he went to find another wanderer on the street and took the initiative to get to know him. His purpose was to be able to return to a happy life without being wanted. This wanderer was unaware of the man's plans. He happily continued talking and drinking with the man until the middle of the night. The man purposefully made up enough stories to distract the wanderer, so that he was so drunk that he was no longer conscious. After that, he waited. When this vagrant was not alert, the man grabbed the bottle of wine that was placed on the table, looked at the wanderer, and prepared to take action. The wanderer was now too drunk to know anything, lying against the wall behind him to sleep. The man took the opportunity and slowly walked in front of the wanderer. He killed the wanderer and then broke his face so that no one could identify the wanderer. He decided to live with this man's identity. After taking action, he remained to search all over the wanderer's body, took all the money of the victim and identification documents to avoid finding the identity of the corpse, and blatantly started living a new life. He used his savings and the money he had stolen from the wanderer to go to a small plastic surgery clinic and had a face surgery similar to the one in the papers. He had to stay in the hospital for a long time to recover. Fortunately, the surgery was successful, and he was finally able to remove the bandages to see his new face. He happily looked at himself in the mirror, looked closely at every 5 senses on his new face, and breathed a sigh of relief when he escaped the police's pursuit. After he was done, he left and rented a small house to live in. He decided to live with his new face, work, and start a family like nothing ever happened. Meanwhile, the victims who the man killed were all found by the police and became a case that shook the country. He applied to re-enter the old company with a new name, and then he got promoted higher and higher. He became a rich man, got married, and enjoyed the high life. But since then, this nightmare had appeared in his life. After telling his story, the man expressed deep regret for the atrocities he had done before. He repeatedly begged the magician to help him, fearing that the wanderer's spirit would come and retrieve his face. The man's cruelty made the magician unable to hold back. The magician directly slapped the man's face with an angry slap as if to vent his anger on behalf of the people he killed. But the man's stupidity made him no longer rational. He thought that as long as the magician hit him, everything would be erased, with no pity in his heart for the dead. Seeing this, the magician smiled and asked the man's address under the pretext of performing an exorcism. After that, this magician told him to leave, promising to help him sleep well. As soon as he left, the magician took out his phone and called the police station, telling the man's story and turning over the old murder case. The man was arrested after many years of hiding. He must be punished for the crimes he committed. There was a strange apartment in the apartment building where I was renting. Although this apartment was in the high-end segment, the rental price was very cheap. The current owner of the apartment was a young female office worker. She lived in an apartment alone and had only recently moved here. Until one day the girl was about to go to bed after a long day of working outside when she encountered a scary and strange thing right in her apartment. At that time, she was standing in the bathroom and looking in the mirror when suddenly, outside the door, there was a shadow of another girl with long, flowing hair looking at her from outside. The female office worker, the owner of the apartment, did not have time to understand what was happening when suddenly this woman moved quickly and rushed through the door. The young girl thought that a stranger had broken into her apartment, so she immediately ran out to check. When she went out, the hallway outside had become strangely cold and gloomy. The girl came from the bathroom and looked in the direction the strange woman had just passed. That woman also knew that the girl had seen her. She stood still, her back to the inside with a very mysterious gesture. Then, slowly the woman turned back. She looked monstrous, her eyes bloodshot like the devil, her skin pale and pale like a dead person. She looked at the girl with a devilish smile. The horror didn't stop there. This strange woman suddenly greeted the girl. The horror image in front of the girl made her bewildered. Knowing she had encountered something she couldn't have met, the girl could only explain in panic. Her screams echoed throughout the apartment block. But when they heard the screams coming from this apartment, no one who lived in the building dared to go to the apartment to check and act like they didn't know anything. The following day, the girl went to the building's management office to narrate everything that happened the previous night. After the young employee heard the story, he felt that this girl was just hallucinating, so he apologized profusely and reassured the girl with a few idle sentences to finish the story. This young man's superficial attitude made the girl even angrier. She demanded that the management return her rent and deposit. After saying that, the girl hurriedly went out and returned to her apartment to pack up her luggage, prepared to move to another apartment to live in because she no longer dared to stay in this place. When the girl left, the young man felt strange. He went to his boss and asked him why every guest in that apartment said the apartment was haunted. The boss heard, then sighed. When he was calm, he confirmed to the young man that what the girl said was true. When the young man heard that, he became more and more curious, asking his boss the beginning and the end of the story. After listening to this, the manager also slowly recalled and told the employee who had just come in to hear the story that had happened in this apartment. He said that the apartment was haunted by a case that happened nearly 10 years ago. At that time, the whole building was the most famous luxury apartment project in the city. In the same haunted apartment, its previous owner was a woman named Wing. She rented this apartment to live alone. Occasionally, her lover would visit and sleep over. Her affair was a wealthy but married businessman. The two had a long-standing affair because Wing's fiancé settled in the US and would welcome her to live there next year. Wing loved this mistress very much, but in the man's heart, Wing was just a stupid girl and had a lot of money. His purpose in approaching Wing was to extract her money. On the contrary, Wing was infatuated with the handsomeness and style of her lover. She determined to serve him to the end. That time, like so many other times before, he asked Wing for money under the pretense of investing in a business project. She waited until the lover was gone, then took out her phone and called her fiancé to ask for money. It was not the first time Wing had asked for money from her fiancé to give it to her lover. Every time she came up with compelling reasons. One day, Wing was asking for money from her fiancé as usual with the excuse to send it back to her family when suddenly disaster struck. It was around noon. The whole building was empty of people. No one noticed what was around them. Wing was sitting in the house talking on the phone when suddenly the doorbell rang. Curious, she turned off the phone and went out to check it out. Wing looked through the small window on the door, and outside was a middle-aged man, said to be the building management. Wing didn't think anything of it, opened the door, and invited the man inside with a carefree attitude. Unexpectedly, the door just opened. The man's arm pushed inside, making Wing suddenly unable to react. Two men suddenly burst into Wing's apartment, including her fiancé. He directly slapped her like hell and then blamed her for cheating on him. Wing then fell to the ground, powerless to resist. Her fiancé and his friend took her to her bedroom and assaulted her. Wing held the phone in one hand to call her lover and repeatedly plead with the other two men to spare her life. But her fiancé refused to agree to forgive her. He said he had to take revenge on her today. Both men walked in front of Wing. Wing screamed for help, but no one around could hear her screams. Her fiancé rushed over, grabbed Wing's hair, put her on the bed, and then with his friend did an act of debauchery with her. Wing screamed in pain and despair. Outside, her lover had also been standing there before, but he did not dare to enter because of his cowardice. He stood trembling in shock at the door and did not dare to shout for fear of being implicated. After a while of ideological struggle, Wing's lover also decided to leave the apartment, running straight out as if he didn't know anything. When her lover ran away, Wing's voice also stopped. The whole room fell into silence. Then two men from the apartment also came out. Wing was raped by both men and then strangled to death with a belt. Her body lay on the ground motionless, looking very pitiful. Wing's body lay there until the evening without anyone around or knowing what had happened. In the middle of the night, the lover decided to return to Wing's apartment by way of the balcony to get his phone back and not wanting to be involved in Wing's affairs. He climbed through the window and went straight into Wing's bedroom. At that time, he did not know that Wing was already dead, so he calmly went inside. But when he got there, the lights of the apartment were turned off. He thought he could safely leave this troubled woman. He went to the kitchen first to check, but overall everything was neat and undisturbed. Then he sneaked into the bedroom, alone. In the darkness, he saw Wing lying dead on the ground, but his face showed no trace of panic. He searched the room in hopes of finding his phone quickly, and then left the scene before becoming a suspect in a murder. But before he could find his phone, he heard a cold breath behind him. And Wing's voice calling to him began to resound with hatred. He unconsciously turned back to check and saw that Wing had turned into a ghost with bloodshot eyes, her mouth constantly rebuking him for abandoning her. Her face revealed a terrifying horror. She cursed her lover to the fullest, scolded him severely, and forced him to stay with her forever. A moment later, in front of the betrayed mistress was a dark night. He screamed in terror and then turned into a madman. He found a chair in the house and prepared himself a noose on high, and then committed suicide. The bodies of both were found only when they were in a state of decomposition, emitting a stench. The case had not yet caught the main culprit. Since then, the souls of both had been trapped in the apartment, causing many tenants to move elsewhere. Some say they encountered a girl's spirit with a look of hatred. Others say they encountered a man. The story ends in the young man's panic. Later, the apartment was also locked and sealed, not allowing anyone to enter it ever again. When I came back to my hometown for the summer vacation a few years ago, I happened to encounter something very strange that obsessed me and my friends. My village had a large stream near the forest edge. The water was always rolling like in the sea, but the water level was not that high. Some other children in the village and I had a hobby of going to the stream to catch fish. We felt safe when we played here because the water level was just above our knees. Our favorite game was always a fishing contest in which we compete to see who would catch the most fish. We all loved this game so much that we kept playing until it was nearly dark. We would catch a small fish only until the sun went down and the sunset embraced my village. When we saw the fish struggling in the basket, we all shouted with delight as if we had discovered a treasure. More or less, fish we caught were placed in a large bucket of water next to us to be taken home for dinner. We were discussing bringing these fish home as the sky darkened, when I happened to notice a shadow at the head of the river. Curiosity drove me to turn my gaze to the shadowy figure of the large man in front of me. I tried to look around to see who this man was, but I couldn't recognize him. In the dim light, I noticed a large man with a bloated stomach and pale skin. His head was bald, his face was lifeless, and he kept his gaze fixed on the rushing flow. When I noticed this, I summoned my friends and gazed into the direction of the enigmatic giant man. The other boys were surprised to see the man, believing that they had never seen him before in my village. Suddenly, this man turned to face us and waved at us. As soon as I realized this, I turned to my friends and asked if they wanted to go to the mysterious man's place. We were hesitant and scared at first because we were meeting strangers. My friends even called out to that man, but he didn't respond. He kept staring at us, his behavior enigmatic, but inviting. His hand kept beckoning us. We began to wonder at this point. My backup friend advised me to give a try and go to the man to check it out. So we all decided to run to this big man to find out who he was. We dashed off and called out loud to ask for his name, but he remained silent in the distance. I could see this man until I was only a few meters away, and suddenly I couldn't see him anymore. When we arrived at his previous location, we discovered him lying on a large rock. His entire body became stiff and motionless. His skin was the same color as the large rock below. We got close to this big man at this point, realizing he might be as big as a rock in the middle of the river, which made us both scared and curious. We formed a circle around the man, gradually learning about his strange behavior. Suddenly he opened his eyes. A strange pair of eyes that didn't look human glared at me, and he looked like a corpse instead of a human. We all screamed in terror and immediately took a step back. We didn't start running home until we saw him standing up straight and we forgot our fish tank. When I got home, I immediately told my parents about the incident on the stream bank. My face flushed with fear. The adults in the house began to go out to check, inadvertently meeting my friends' families and hearing the same story. I was alone in my room that night, not daring to leave, anxiously awaiting my parents' response. In my mind, I suddenly remembered the story of the giant stone man that my grandmother had always told me when I was a child, and I felt a chill. Instead of being obsessed by the giant stone man on the other side of the river, I decided to go to bed early. After a while of thinking, I began to feel tired. My eyes were closed, and I was about to fall asleep. But as night fell, I was startled to feel a cold wind blowing into my room, just like what I felt like at the riverbank. Before I could understand what was going on, there was a very loud noise passing by my house outside my room's windows, which piqued my interest enough that I had to wake up to investigate. Looking out the windows, I noticed a figure approaching, still holding a large bronze gong and occasionally knocking on it. Everyone in my village could hear the sound of bronze gongs, but every time this man passed by any house, the windows and main door were slammed shut. I was the only one who opened the windows and looked outside to see what was going on because I was too curious. I tried to hide behind the wall, hoping no one would notice me as I waited for the man with the gongs to arrive. A figure appeared a few moments later. I recognized the faint shadow of the giant I met earlier on the riverbank from afar. He was walking straight towards my house, trailed by a shaman who was striking a gong to indicate the way. When the man arrived at my house, I noticed that there was still a few cracks on his body that looked like a large rock had been broken into pieces. The shaman in the back walked behind the giant, holding the gong and knocking each time, mumbling the incantation as if guiding him. The gong sounded very loud. The more I heard it, the more my ears became numb, and it became louder and louder. An unpleasant fishy odor suddenly arose from the giant's body as he began to approach in front of my windows. At this point, I realized with horror that this stone man was not only a massive rock in the shape of a human, but also a corpse. As he walked, he lowered his face to the ground, his eyes gleaming like the devil's. Wherever he went, the flesh on his body fell to the ground and formed murky puddles that resembled river water. His flesh began to disintegrate, forming pools of water one by one along the road in my village, smelling like fish. I saw the horror scene unfolding in front of my eyes and had to scream in fear. My yell inadvertently struck the giant in front of me. He abruptly changed color, his sight softened, and his face was startled, as if he had just realized something. He began to turn his face to look directly at me, leaving me perplexed and confused as how to handle it. He glared at me with evil eyes. His mouth began to decompose, and his teeth were nearly completely gone. Then, he approached my windows as if he was about to break in and take me away. In a panic, I jumped back intending to close the windows to protect myself. The shaman walking behind saw everything at the precise moment. He appeared to recognize the danger in front of me. His eyes became more serious. He struck the bronze gong right away, and the sound of the gong immediately drew the giant's attention. Then he turned to me and told me to be quiet. After that, he knocked the gong repeatedly while mumbling the incantation. The gong's sound was becoming increasingly loud. When this giant heard the gong, he suddenly floated into the air and became motionless, creating a ghostly and frightening scene. The shaman then knocked the gong and hurried to get the stone giant out of the village as soon as possible, not forgetting to tell me to close the windows and stop being nosy. I was too curious at the time, and I couldn't control myself, so I stayed by the window frame, keeping an eye on the figure that was slowly vanishing. The shaman then turned and led his massive stone man down a path that led into the forest by the river where we played at this afternoon. I winced, perplexed. I had no idea what the hell this giant stone man was, but it was extremely frightening to me. I only knew that inside the forest where the shaman led the stone man, a very large old tree was discovered, along with a large stone that looked very strange. It was a mysterious story about the forbidden forest in my village. To develop the economy, the government had widened the road to facilitate traffic. The big road was opened, leading to the investment of many rich business owners. They came here to develop an ecotourism area. According to the project, cranes and workers were sent to work. They embarked on replanting the forest, cutting down all the trees to get vacant land. But when the cleanup was complete, the workers discovered a huge old tree standing tall, almost as high as a hill. This discovery made the whole group of workers worried. They decided to wait until the following morning to blow up the stump. While observing, a worker working in the delegation discovered a dark figure standing on top looking down. He didn't know how the mysterious man got to the top. The man slowly walked from the inside to the side of the hill. His face was gradually revealed wrinkled like an older man with dark black eyes, wearing the village's long-standing collar. The worker's gaze could not escape the figure of the mysterious older man, but the more the worker looked, the more curious he felt in his heart. The worker seemed to be hypnotized, standing there for several minutes. It was not until a colleague from afar came to call him that he woke up. He pointed to the top of the tree stump and told his colleagues about seeing the mysterious older man standing aloft in a trembling voice. But strangely enough, when they both looked up, the strange older man had disappeared, leaving no trace. This thing made his colleagues laugh at him. No one believed the young worker's story. That evening, the working workers returned to their tents to rest. They gathered in a large tent to light a fire and talk. The group of workers sat by the fire playing cards. After a game, the young worker suddenly became uncomfortable, so he went back to his bed first. After that, everything went on as if nothing happened. Only the worker that night suddenly had a cold, as if he was sick. By the middle of the night, the cold air and fog surrounded the small tent. Outside, the sky shot up with a fierce flash of lightning. With only a few lightning bolts, the sky poured down a force and rushing rain, drenching the surrounding land. Inside the tent, the young worker felt more uncomfortable cold air on his toes running up his body. This thing caused his whole body to tremble with each convulsion. He turned around slightly, just in time to sound of the tent zipper sounding like someone who was coming in, and started calling his name. The whispering voice at the head of the bed made the young man unable to sleep. He opened his eyes a little to see what was going on. The worker looked dreamily towards the door, saw that it was bright outside. The rain and wind pulled into the cold tent. A dark shadow was slowly walking towards him. The young man couldn't make out the face of the person standing in front of the tent. He could only feel as if this person was wearing a form of traditional clothing and a hat that had been around for a long time. The older man walked like a fly, slowly entered the tent, and walked back to the front of the worker's bed. This thing caused the worker to panic and sat up. The appearance of the older man at this time also appeared in front of the young man. He was sure that he had seen a ghost. The eyes of the older man suddenly turned red with anger. He opened his mouth wide, shouting to chase these workers away. The worker heard every word this man said, so he nodded in agreement in panic. He kept saying that he would go now and begging his spirit to spare his life, then sat up. looking around with a panicked look in his eyes. His screams woke up other workers who were sleeping around. Everyone was surprised and asked him what was wrong. The worker at this time seemed to regain some consciousness, pointed out to the door of the tent, and recounted the dream he had met earlier. When his colleague heard about it, he remembered the incident in the afternoon and got angry, pulled the blanket and aggressively got out of the bed, forcing the worker to take him out to check. The two took a flashlight and went straight outside, grumbled, making everyone in the tent nervous. But after only a few minutes of searching with the searchlight, both workers also saw something strange that they should not have seen themselves. The strange phenomenon before their eyes made the two men feel anxious. They crept back into the tent to guard and observe. Both of the workers held flashlights and pointed forward where there was a bright yellow light like fire right at the base of the ancient tree in the afternoon. But when they looked closely, the old worker thought it was just an ordinary fire that was being magnified by being too close to the tent, causing the young worker to see it wrong. He turned to blame the young worker for not being careful, disturbing the sleep of other colleagues. But the young man didn't care, pointing forward. The colleague next to him saw this and looked in the direction of the hand. Both of them panicked when they saw that they had not been near any ancient trees until now, but this strange thing gave the workers here a bad premonition. The group woke up from the tent together, equipped with protective gear, and ran towards the direction of the ancient tree. Here they saw a bright yellow fire was burning fiercely, but as soon as the team reached the place, this fire was completely extinguished. In front of the group of workers also appeared a large cave. The workers followed the path leading to the bottom and were shocked to discover that 2 coffins had been placed here. The team was confused by what they had just found. Everyone was panicking and extremely worried because the team did not know how to deal with these 2 coffins. While the team was busy trying to find a solution, there was a loud sound from the tents, sounding like broken rock, very scary, making the whole team of workers look back in surprise. The incident happened in front of the workers' eyes as quickly as the blink of an eye. No one had time to move, they just stood still and watched the big rocks rolling down from above. The rocky hill behind the tents suddenly moved. The ground also trembled. There was also a crackling sound from the hillside and the sound of dust pouring down below. Huge rocks poured down below, pressing on the small tents. In the blink of an eye, rocks were able to level the ground. This thing was like a giant rock man, smashing the tents in front of him with his hands. Those who were present to witness a strange and scary event at that time could not keep their composure and also knew in their hearts that they had just made a big mistake that was difficult to repair. The team was seen to be dumbfounded by the wreckage right in front of them for a long time. But the young worker alone thought that this was also a blessing, because if they did not go out, they would also be crushed to death by these giant rocks. Looking at the crushed tents and the working tools of each worker, no one could help but feel pity. After regaining their spirits, the workers immediately discussed with each other, figuring out how to handle the messy things here. People were divided into groups to work. One group actively called the management report. Another group started going out to see if there were any tools left. The current situation made outsiders sigh because the working tools were no longer usable, and they had to wait for support from the manager. The rest of the group in the cave checked the neck of the coffin. Everyone began to work together to open the coffin lid to check inside and discovered a set of remains. Based on the remains of the bones, this was the remains of a man buried here in the last century. In the place where the coffin was found, the workers also found a long-standing hat for the village officials. The hat on the ground surprised the young worker because it was the same hat that the older man he saw was wearing. Lately, I heard my grandmother recount that the place was formerly the burial place of old mandarins. Although many coffins had been excavated for a long time, there was still a coffin of the first official in the village inside. After this incident, the other group of construction workers all resigned because they were so scared. The project was also stopped. Later, historians also came and excavated the surviving ancient tomb and brought it to another place for proper burial. I went on a business trip for a few days a long time ago. Fortunately, I was able to find a low-cost day-to-day apartment for rent near my workplace. I took the time after landing in the afternoon to have dinner, then carried my luggage to the apartment where I would be staying. The apartment that I rented was on the 3rd floor. The entire corridor had also very few rooms, and the quiet atmosphere made me quite happy. After finding my apartment, I took the key and was about to enter when I met a student girl walking up from the stairs who lived on the same floor as me. She became more timid as soon as she saw me, making me a little shy. I greeted her politely first, and she also responded. I introduced her that I was staying in this apartment. Suddenly, the girl's attitude changed. She looked at me with serious eyes and she said loudly, "You can't stay here." I just stood there surprised and perplexed, staring at her with my eyes wide open. I tried to ask her why I couldn't be here, but she kept saying, you can't, okay? You can't," instead of explaining anything else. After a few sentences, she hastily said goodbye to me and left, leaving me with a lot of unanswered questions in my head. I also wanted to keep her to stay to ask more questions, but it was late and I needed to rest, so I said nothing and kept doing my stuff. I carried my luggage into the room, couldn't help thinking about what the girl had said. I dashed to the bathroom as soon as I arrived to wash my face and took a shower. I went to my bedroom and sat on the large bed in the center of the room checking my phone. I was sitting on the bed, earphones in my ears, my gaze fixed on the exciting football match on the screen. Because this apartment only had one bedroom, the entire place had descended into a terrifying silence. I was so engrossed in the match that I screamed like a fan watching it live at the football pitch. After watching, I quickly placed my phone on the bed to prepare for food after a long and exhausting day of traveling. I soaked an Everescent tablet in a glass of water before going to bed to boost my resistance and started drinking it. My body began to feel tired after drinking. I immediately placed a glass of water on the dressing table beside the bed and began to recline. But as soon as I was looking down across the mirror, I noticed a dark figure reflecting in the mirror staring at me. I was startled unconsciously and quickly turned around to check, but there was no one behind me. The entire room was just me. I sighed, thinking I was so tired that I became dizzy. I forgot about the strange thing and went to bed, continuing to look at my phone and talk to my family. I started to feel sleepy at midnight, leaving me with no choice but to sleep. But I couldn't sleep that night, tossing and turning. There was always a feeling in my heart that a certain heat was blowing up from under my bed. I started sweating on my brows, and the room had been drained of air, leaving only unpleasant hot air and a suffocating burning smell. I had the impression that someone was sitting behind me at the time, but I couldn't open my eyes to see because I was so tired, until the heat and burning smell became unbearable that I awoke, opened my eyes quickly and saw a thick grey smoke flying in front of me. I turned around in fear, startled. Two people as black as coal appeared in front of my eyes. Smoke erupted from their entire bodies and sat at my feet. Their bodies emitted the revolting odor of burnt meat. They didn't say anything and sat quietly on the bed, face down, eyes fixed on some unknown space. I tried to rub my eyes and regain my composure while staring at the two people in front of me. They appeared to be real human beings, but they had no skin, and the flesh beneath had been burned to black, revealing the muscles deep within the body. The biggest and most muscular one appeared to be a man, as his body looked to be very solid. I believed the person next to me was a woman. I saw her flesh melting in the smoke like an ice cream under the sun. I believed this was a prank by the apartment owner to defraud me of my rent, so I quickly drew up the blanket, sat up, and inquired as to who these two strange people were and why they were in my room. Both of them did not respond. Instead, they turned to face me with their deformed faces. They opened their mouths and moved their lips as if they wanted to say something but couldn't because of the burns on their mouth and tongue muscles. After a while, both of them stood up, their eyes fixed on me. I was so terrified by the scene that I froze. I held my hands tight on the bed, didn't dare to move. The heat and smoke also caused the sweat on the forehead to flow more profusely. After that, both black shadows rushed towards me and pressed against me, leaving me speechless. The two began to howl, expressed a great pain on their faces. The smoke was also becoming thicker, as if it wanted to swallow them both. Both of them kept rushing to me, looking at me with pleading eyes, but their mouths stiffened, unable to speak. When the man rushed over and grabbed my shoulders, then pressed his hot-burning body against mine, then I felt his body pressing against my face like a giant coal, causing me to scream in pain. After a while, the smoke and the hot air began to dissipate, but I felt as if I had entered a completely different world. My mind was racing like a drunk, and my limbs were frozen in place, making me hard to breathe. I found myself in this room in the blink of an eye, but the arrangement had changed, and there was now a couple sleeping on the bed. Outside, the husband neatly parked the motorcycle next to the door and carefully locked it. For no apparent reason, the bottom of the tire burst into flames. The fire engulfed the motorcycle in an instant, incinerating it in just a few minutes. The couple was awakened by the sound of the engine crackling outside and the smell of smoke. They were both startled to sit up when they saw the fire spread throughout the house. The fire burned the entire door and then spread all over four corners of the wall, followed the brick floor below to attack the couple's bed and burned the blanket below. Because there was no way out, the couple was trapped inside, preying on the raging fire. The scene appeared to be hell. The young couple writhed in the sea of fire, their bodies shrinking and turning black. The fire eventually turned them both into disfigured skeletons, blackened and stiff as coal. Everything in this room was completely burned down when the rescue team arrived. After the dream ended, I was startled to find myself in the same accident room, confused and unsure of what was going on. My head throbbed with excruciating pain at the same time. I had to try to hold my head before crawling up, only to discover that I had been lying on the ceramic floor for who knows how long. I exhaled laboriously. Fortunately, what I saw was either the past of the room or a nightmare, and I was still safe and sound. I was haunted by the nightmare. Later, I discovered that this apartment had a fire before, and that the house's owner couple had also died in the fire. The next day, I contacted to give back the room and quickly found myself a new room. The owner was also aware of the reason, so he did not make things difficult for me, and I relocated to another apartment. My father lost his arm when he was young. I tried many times to ask the cause, but it was not until now that my father told me about that thrilling story. At that time, my father had just married my mother not long ago and lived in a high mountain surrounded by only wild animals and plants. To make a living, my father had to go to the mountains to hunt wild animals. Once my father went to the mountains to hunt animals in a snow-covered sky. In the distance he saw a wild rabbit. Waiting until this rabbit didn't notice, my father opened fire. The bullet went through the poor rabbit's abdomen, causing it to fall on the spot, stiffening its whole body. The rabbit then tried to roll a few more laps in the snow and then collapsed. My father saw it all from afar. He hid behind a large tree nearby and then slowly walked out to check the animal's condition. My father tried to make his way through the line of thick white snow, straight to the rabbit's direction. His eyes did not forget to look around to watch out for wild animals. When my father was only a few meters away from the hare, he heard footsteps and animal sounds in the distance. My father realized that this was the sound of a small animal's footsteps, so he suddenly looked up. Accidentally, he saw a cave. Inside it was covered with several layers of straw and dry leaves. My dad guessed it was the cave of the rabbit he shot down. In his heart, then, rose a feeling of guilt and awkwardness. Suddenly next to him came the sound of wild animals. My father looked up and saw a group of white foxes coming out of nowhere, standing around the carcass of the little rabbit. My father scratched his head and thought to himself, this group of white foxes must have been in the forest for a long time and had no food, but now they could smell wild game meat, so they pulled the whole group out like that. So my father decided to give this rabbit to the foxes, and he went to another place to continue hunting. This time, he decided to go deeper into the forest. He hoped to catch more rabbits or some other big animal for my mother to make dinner. My father's gunshot rang out continuously, but there was only one more hare. My father thought that one rabbit would be enough, so when he saw the rabbit lying motionless, he slowly went out to check. He had only taken a few steps when suddenly, my father heard a loud noise and a cold breath appeared from behind him. The footsteps of wild animals also sounded from there, but they were getting closer and closer to my father. My father, out of curiosity, quietly went to the place where the noise was coming from. He hoped to find another animal for himself. But when he arrived, in front of him suddenly appeared a grizzly bear, a head taller than him, busy looking for food. As soon as it saw my father, the grizzly bear determined that this would be his prey, so it rushed forward, its eyes also starting to turn red in anger. The bear rushed through the trees and grabbed my father. Then it opened its big mouth and bit my father's hand hard. My father screamed in pain. He was overwhelmed by the weight and the huge body of this bear crushed on the ground. He was unable to resist. It attacked my father so fast that he could not fire a gun to fight back. The wound also began to appear intense pain. My father writhed on the ground, one hand clutching the bleeding wound. At this point, my father seemed to have completely collapsed and lost all hope. The bear saw my father screaming. It thought that my father was threatening it, so the anger in its heart also increased because of that. It roared loudly, shouting straight at my father's face as if it wanted to eat him alive in one shot. My father was too scared, plus the freezing cold of the winter mountains, leading to a loss of strength and slowly fainting. He seemed to have no more faith anymore, so he closed his eyes and surrendered his fate to God to decide. His whole body was no longer able to move and was as cold as an iceberg. It took a long time for my father to regain his sanity. He was like a man who fell asleep in the forest. He woke up and opened his eyes to see. He realized he was still lying in the forest on the white snow, but the big bear had disappeared. He started to get up, making his way home. The wound on his head also continued to ache, even though the blood had been frozen by the snow. He looked around for his direction, but the snow was so heavy that it blocked his path. Suddenly a shadow appeared in front of him. This strange figure slowly approached my father. he recognized it as a young girl with a mysterious appearance. He knew that it was a strange thing for a young girl to appear in the forest, but because he had no other hope, he took a risk and chased after the girl. Suddenly she turned around, looked at my father with eyes as bright as a fox's eye, and coldly told my father to follow her. My father was bewildered and did not understand anything, but his mind was now hypnotized, only following this girl unconsciously. The girl kept walking straight ahead through the blizzard as if nothing had happened, leaving my father to remain puzzled. When my father felt that he couldn't keep going straight ahead anymore, he called the girl over to ask, but my father just opened his mouth when the whole person fell into a state of loss of feeling. My father no longer remembered anything after that, only remembering that time his mind was spinning blank, walking behind the girl even though he did not know who this girl was. The strange girl continued to lead my father in a straight line. They went through the dry, snowy trees, little by little out of the murky, dangerous forest. Then this girl took my father to a cliff. Since then my father had never crossed this road, but as long as he followed the girl, he could cross this cliff very easily. At the same time, at home, my mother saw that the snow was falling more and more densely, but my father hadn't returned. One insecurity also began to appear in her heart, so she decided to risk going alone into the forest to find my father. My mother quickly put on her shirt and went out nervously. But when my mother came out, she suddenly saw that my father had returned to the front of the house in a lifeless form. My father's whole body was cold to blue and purple all over his body. He could only stand motionless and couldn't do anything else. My mother saw this, panicked, and rushed to hug my father, feeling the cold that turned his body into a giant iceberg. After my mother touched his body, he immediately fainted. My mother was scared, struggling and confused, not knowing what to do, nor understanding what had happened. My mother called for a long time but did not see my father answer. He was still seriously injured, causing him to panic. My mother tried to help my father, but she was pulled by the weight of my father's frozen body to the ground. My mother tried to call and shake him, but my father still couldn't wake up. But at the same time, my mother accidentally looked outside the gate to see which benefactor had brought him home, and saw a strange thing. In the snow, falling more and more, my mother saw the faint shadows of a flock of small foxes. They stood far enough away from my house and refused to come any closer. My mother also gradually understood the problem, so she brought my father inside. After seeing that their father had reached home safely, the foxes also quietly returned to the deep forest and disappeared. The most impressive of my mother in the story was the fox in the middle, with bright blue eyes and white fur that blends in with the snow, constantly watching the house. The doctor then also came to check on my father's condition. Fortunately, he still managed to save his life, but the wound on his hand was severely necrotic and had to be amputated. Both my father and mother were heartbroken over that. That was why my father stopped hunting, but he still didn't forget his strange story in his heart. Not only that, but he also considered it to be the other fox elf that turned into a human to help him find his way home. After that, my father tried to return to the forest to find the foxes many times, but he had never seen them ever again. This is a story that happened a long time ago in my village, when I was a high school student about to take my final exam. I used to stay up until early morning to review my lessons because that was when the area where I lived was the quietest. I resolved to complete all of my homework before going to bed, but it always seemed to pile up like a mountain. When I realized I didn't have the energy to keep going, I sat back in my chair and rested for a few minutes. Many days had passed and I'd always studied until I was exhausted and my eyes couldn't open any longer. So I sat down at the table, intending to sleep for nearly 30 minutes in order to regain my energy. I was sleeping when I heard some loud noises outside that sounded like a trumpet and bride procession music. The music became increasingly louder as the group approached nearer to my house, making it impossible for me to sleep any longer. I started to feel uncomfortable and secretly blamed that family for having such a late night wedding. At first, I considered returning to my desk and ignoring outside distractions in order to focus on my homework, but no matter how hard I tried, I was distracted by outside noises. Outside, the singing was like a magical power entering my mind, making it impossible for me to concentrate on my own affairs. This time, I resolved to focus with all my might, staring at the page in front of me, my mind ignoring the trumpets playing outside. But in the end, I couldn't take it any longer, so I slammed my fist on the table and sat up in rage. I drank a small sip of water to relax and then went to the windows, intending to wait for the bride to come to complain. I slowly opened the windows and began to look outside to see how far this procession had progressed. In the dark night, a large group of people and the shadow of a palanquin appeared from afar in the dense fog. I couldn't see the faces of anyone in the group because it was too dark and there was an overcast fog. But what drew my attention to this group of people was their unusual appearance. They walked and danced in strange movements. The scene in front of me began to make me wonder, fearful and curious. I had no idea if they were any of people in my village. After a while, the group stopped singing and simply blew the trumpet loudly. I began to feel helpless because I considered it as a joyful activity for other people's families. So I didn't want to interfere and instead sat in the house with curious eyes. After a while, the procession arrived at my house as well. I began to rise, intending to share my blessings on this group of people. But when the group began to appear clearly under the dim street lights, I was astounded to see each person's face. They were not normal humans. Their faces were also blurred, and they resembled demons from hell. Their skins were pale, their cheeks rosy, and their lips always smiled. Even worse, the flesh had all vanished, leaving only a few wrinkled pieces clinging to the concave bones. They were carrying the palanquin while grinning manically. The wind came out of nowhere and yanked open the palanquin's curtain, revealing the empty space inside. I panicked. I wanted to scream but couldn't. All I could do was stand still and watch the group in front of me. I knew they weren't normal people like me, so when they were just passing by, I turned inside the house, clutching my mouth and trembling. The trumpet was right next to my ear. I could clearly feel the bright blue eyes outside staring at me from inside the room. When I tried to look outside, not only did the man carrying the palanquin, but also the girl walking in the middle of the group was also staring at me with a ghostly expression. I shivered, every now and then not sure if it was from the cold running down my spine as the group passed by or because I was too scared. I took a deep breath and tried to look out the windows, just as the eyes on the other side met mine. I was startled and quickly hid behind the wall, dozens of confusing questions ringing in my head before going blank. I sat down on the ground, hugging my knees and shivering, feeling that the songs outside were the magic that was trying to fascinate me. I grimaced, gritted my teeth, and waited for the group to leave before standing up to assess the situation outside. In the hazy smoke, the procession of the palanquin had traveled a long distance by the end of the village. I had never taken my gaze away from them. I could clearly see the procession of people bringing that red palanquin to a dilapidated house that had long been abandoned. Despite the fact that the procession group had traveled a long distance, I could still hear the sound of the drums and trumpets. The group abruptly came to a halt in front of that abandoned house. The trumpet sound was also deafeningly quiet. The group stood motionless, surrounded by a gloomy atmosphere. After a few seconds, the group brought the palanquin inside and quietly left. When I looked at the house within the black scorch marks, I was taken aback by recalling the heartbreaking story that had occurred here. Not so long ago, this wooden house was the most well-known and spacious restaurant in my village. No one was unaware of it. On this day a few years ago, a big wedding was held at this restaurant. The atmosphere was very lively here. Guests had been eating and drinking in the restaurant for quite a long time. Everyone was anticipating the arrival of the bride for the ceremony. Both sides of the family were extremely busy. Congratulations could be heard throughout the restaurant, and the atmosphere was extremely lively at this time. By the middle of the party, the restaurant downstairs was filling up with black smoke. A man became frightened and ran upstairs. When he arrived, he quickly shouted, informing those present of the fire that was raging downstairs. After hearing that, the people at the party that day began to let go of their chopsticks, their mouths gaping at the panicking man in front of them. The black smoke from downstairs spread to the party's area as soon as the sentence ended, and the guests began to stir. Those present could see the deadly fire rising from the restaurant's window as if it wanted to burn down the entire establishment. Everyone began to stand up one by one, frantically looking for a way out. Loud screams rang throughout the restaurant, but no one could help them. The villagers who had also heard about the fire curiously ran over, standing below helplessly looking inside. Before the fire truck arrived, some people began using the most basic fire suppression methods in the hope of reducing the severity of the incident. However, the fire in the night transformed into a demon, quickly devouring both the restaurant and the people who were present. The fire burned into their bodies, consuming all those fleeting in the blink of an eye, and no one had a chance to escape. In the ocean of flame, the black shadows appearing by the upstairs windows begging for help, and then fell down. That image haunted the people of my village. The signboard for the restaurant was also set ablaze. The fire had been extinguished by dawn, but the memories associated with this restaurant had also been reduced to ashes. Fire trucks were parking along the road to the village that night, and no one dared to go out because they were so terrified. The village changed over time, becoming a busy street, but the restaurant remained as how it was after that night. I shivered in bed all night, unable to sleep, because the burned spirits in the fire that night kept haunting me. Every time I took a nap, those ghostly horror faces appeared in my dreams, worsening my health. Outside the windows, in particular, I always had the distinct impression that the group was still standing there, peering inside and calling my name. Every night after the entire village had fallen asleep, the sound of the trumpet and the image of the wedding procession to the burned-out restaurant appeared. Many people claimed to have seen the bride in the palanquin. She kept singing the wedding carol in the sorrow and pain. Many people said the bride was stunning, with a veil covering her face but allowing them to see her bright white eyes. The smoke from the restaurant suddenly spread every time the procession brought the palanquin into the restaurant, just like the fire scene that year. People in the village spread rumors about the procession group who died in the village. Since then, the restaurant has been deserted, and no one dared to approach and considered the ghost carrying the procession as an anecdote. was a comic book writer due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I worked from home most of the time. In a time of running out of ideas, I went online to read more horror comics as usual, but I never expected to encounter a true horror story that happened in my hometown. The story happened with a man fishing by the main river of the village. He started fishing early in the morning, but it was not until noon that his fishing rod would vibrate. The man saw this, immediately tugged on the fishing line, but it was as if someone stopped him. It took a long time before he was able to pull the rod up and see a big fish. Thinking that he had caught a great deal today, the man was shocked to see the fish's body in front of him. It was no longer a whole fish, because its belly had lost a large piece of flesh, exposing both bones and internal organs. The man who saw the fish was also surprised, not knowing that the bottom of the deep lake was a strange monster, and it was the killer who ate his fish. This monster discovered that a fish was caught in the distance, so it swam to a cup of half of the fish's flesh. After eating, he returned the fish to the hook and quietly swam away without leaving a trace. The man left without thinking. That was why no one in the village knew about the strange story. The following day, a group of women from the village went to the cornfield, located right next to the river, to harvest. Each person picked corn from their field and put it in a basket hanging behind his back. By midday, a woman had already harvested enough corn. She happily greeted everyone and left first. She went straight home, through a cornfield about as tall as an adult, in the direction to the other riverbank. The other two women, seeing this, also quickly harvested their corn and then carried all the corn on their backs and left. On the way, the two also passed by the riverbank. They saw the woman earlier in the middle of the lake. Feeling a little curious, they also stopped to take a look. Both of them saw the woman below was struggling and not knowing what to do, so they stood up from the shore and asked. Hearing the sound of people, the woman in the lake seemed to have met a benefactor, hurriedly shouted for help and pointed at the water, causing the other two women to look at each other. The water in the river kept flowing, but the water level was not too high. Strangely, the woman in the water just burst into tears while reaching for the shore to ask the other two women to help. The two women who saw this also felt troubled. Both of them wanted to come down to help, but neither of them dared to do so. They started looking at each other, discussing to find a long branch of the tree to pass down to the woman below. At the moment, there were footsteps from away. They happily turned around and saw a village man coming from afar. Two hurriedly shouted to the man for help. After seeing the incident, the man quickly went down to help the woman in trouble. The man swam with the fast-flowing water to the woman's place. He reached out his hand as a pedestal for the woman to cling to and tried to bring her to the shore. But when he just got down to the place, the woman was sinking deeper and deeper into the water. He tried, no matter how, he could not lift the woman. He firmly held the rope tied to the cow, and the two girls on the shore tried to push the cow back to borrow more pulling power, pulling both people out of the water. It took a very long time for the cow's strength to pull them both out of the deep water and out of danger. The two with wet bodies were finally safe on shore. The man was trying to dry his clothes while the woman was crying, making everyone curious. Her two friends had to try and ask her to tell her everything in tears. Her face was still full of haunting fear. She told everyone she was pulled down by something in the lake. To prove it, she even rolled up her pants, revealing a big person's handprint still imprinted in black on her leg. Seeing the handprints on the woman's legs, everyone panicked. Everyone worriedly asked her what the hell was dragging her down. But the poor woman couldn't see the killer's face. She just said the hand of this thing was human-like, but slimy like the body of a fish. She recounted at that time she was on her way to bring corn to her house when she passed this lake. On the way, suddenly the woman heard someone calling her, startling her, so she turned to see who it was. But when she turned into the direction of the voice, she saw no one. only a pair of beautiful shoes on the water. Based on the size and shape of the shoe, she knew it would fit her foot well, especially the pattern burned on the shoe. She guessed it was an expensive shoe that someone rich had lost. So the woman decided to leave the corn basket on the shore, pulled up her pants herself and waded into the water to pick up the shoes. But when she was only a few inches from the shoes, suddenly the water moved, creating small waves, pushing the shoe further and further away from the shore. The woman loved the shoe so much, forgot about the danger, waded into the water herself and decided to get the shoes. But at the same time, waves came from nowhere, washed away the shoes in front of her. She was dragged down by some invisible force at the bottom of the lake. After hearing the story, the man seemed very annoyed, so he told the three women to go home and he was prepared to catch something strange at the bottom of the lake tonight. Hearing his words, the women brought back all the corn they harvested. The strange story was also hidden by all four people. No one knew anything more. Thinking that the story was over that night, a young man in the village encountered a strange thing at this very riverbank. He accidentally passed by the riverbank when he heard strange sounds coming from behind the bushes by the riverbank. The curious young man went to the bush to check it out, but he didn't see anything unusual and lingered for a long time to look. Later, not knowing what this young man witnessed in the middle of the night, but immediately screamed and ran away. Then he ran home and turned back with one of his brothers. They carried a large fishing net towards the riverbank. Both began to choose a hidden place for themselves behind the tall trees for easy monitoring. In the middle of the night, the water below the river's surface suddenly appeared in waves like it was a giant moving below. Knowing that the time had come, the two young men slowly went out prepared, waiting for the mysterious thing to appear. Then they would throw the net down to catch it. Fortunately, at that moment, the sound of that strange creature resounded not far from where the two young men were standing. The young man saw all this, determined not to lose opportunity. Immediately threw his big net into the water. A loud noise rang out, grabbing the underwater creature, but it was unclear what was below that the young man alone could not pull up. The companion who was with him also went in to help, but no matter how much the two of them worked together, they could not pull the net up easily because of the creature's weight below. Both were still pulling the net. The net was slowly lifted out of the water, slowly and heavily. The two young men began to estimate that it could only be an adult, but there was no way a fish would weigh that much. After much hard work pulling the net, the two young men finally brought the net ashore. Both excitedly opened up to see what the mysterious creature was. Unexpectedly, it did not get the desired result. In the nets was a giant fish they had never seen since. Moreover, from the fish's belly was also a large piece missing. From then on, people in the village spread stories about the riverside having a monster that no one dared to approach anymore.